She woke up to someone calling her name. The voice was barely audible, as if it were coming from underground. Laura opened her eyes and realized it wasn't a dream. Jake wasn't beside her, and outside the window, in the pitch-black darkness, something was moving. Something big. Laura and Jake were driving along a narrow mountain road surrounded by dense forest. The sun was already setting, and long shadows from the trees stretched across the asphalt, as if trying to grab their car. Laura looked out the window, feeling anxiety slowly creeping into her chest. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no animals, just the wind rustling the leaves, as if whispering to something unseen. "Are you sure we're not lost?" she asked, glancing at the GPS, which had been showing no signal for several minutes. "Relax." Jake smiled, but his voice sounded tense. "We're almost there." They turned onto a dirt road that led deeper into the forest. The car shook on the bumps, and the trees on either side grew thicker, as if closing in behind them. Laura felt her heart start to beat faster. She had always been afraid of forests. They seemed alive to her, as if something ancient and hostile lurked behind every tree. Finally, they reached the cabin. It stood in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. The house looked cozy, but something about it felt wrong. The windows were too small, and the roof was covered in moss, as if the building had long since become part of the forest. "Well, here we are," Jake said, turning off the engine. "Think there's Wi-Fi here?" Laura snorted, but her laughter sounded nervous. They got out of the car, and she was immediately hit by the cold air. The wind carried a strange smell, a mix of dampness, rot, and something metallic. She tried to brush it off, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. The cabin door was unlocked. Inside, it smelled of mold and dust. An old calendar hung on the wall, frozen on October 1987. Laura walked closer and noticed that someone had written in red on the calendar, "They are watching." "Jake, look at this," she called, but he had already gone into the kitchen. "There's cookies here," he shouted from there. "Well, or something that used to be cookies." Laura sighed and decided to ignore the calendar. She walked over to the window and looked out at the forest. Dusk had already fallen, and the trees merged into one solid wall of darkness. She thought she saw something flicker in the depths of the Foresta movement, too fast to be an animal. She squinted, trying to see better, but then Jake had a hand on her shoulder, and she flinched. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he joked. "Maybe I have," she replied, but Jake just laughed. That evening, they lit a fire in the fireplace and settled on the couch. Laura still felt uneasy, but the warmth of the fire calmed her a little. Jake found an old board game in the closet. The box had no name, just a strange symbol resembling intertwined tree branches. "Let's play," he suggested. The rules seemed simple. Laura wanted to refuse, but something about the game drew her in. They started playing. The cards they drew were covered in strange drawings, trees with eyes, hooded figures, symbols that made their blood run cold. Suddenly, Laura drew a card that read, "They have come for you." At that moment, the fire went out. Darkness engulfed the room. Laura screamed when she heard the floorboards creak behind her. Jake grabbed a flashlight, but its beam only revealed emptiness. "It's just a game," he muttered, but his voice trembled. Laura and Jake sat in complete darkness, clinging to each other. The flashlight in Jake's hand shook, its beam catching glimpses of the room. An old couch, a dusty rug, an empty wall with the calendar. But beyond the light, something was moving. Laura heard rustling to the right behind her. "It's just the wind," Jake whispered, but his voice sounded uncertain. "Or maybe mice." "Mice?" Laura squeezed his hand. "Jake, that's not mice." Suddenly, the flashlight went out. Laura screamed, but her voice was drowned out by a strange sound, a low, guttural murmur coming from the corner of the room. It resembled singing, but the melody was unnatural, as if it weren't made by human voices. "We need to get out of here," Laura whispered. "Now." They stood up, holding hands, and began moving toward the door. Laura felt her heart pounding in her chest, her breath becoming shallow and rapid. She was afraid of tripping, afraid her foot would land on something soft and alive. The door was locked. Jake pulled on the handle, but it didn't budge. "Damn it," he whispered. "We didn't lock it, did we?" Laura didn't answer. She heard something scratching at the wall outside. It sounded like claws slowly scraping against wood. She closed her eyes, trying to calm herself, but the words from the diary flashed in her mind. "They come every 33 years. They choose their victims and take them into the forest." "Jake," she whispered, "we need to find another way out." They began moving along the wall, feeling their way in the dark. Laura's hand brushed against something cold and sticky. It was the handle of a door leading to the basement. She pulled it, and the door creaked open. "No," Jake said. "We're not going down there." "We don't have a choice," Laura replied. "Or do you want to stay here with that?" They descended into the basement. The air was even colder, and the smell of dampness and rot became unbearable. Laura fumbled for the light switch, but nothing happened. Jake tried the flashlight again, but it only flickered before dying. "Damn it," he whispered. "The battery's dead." Laura felt something brush against her leg. She screamed and jumped back, but Jake stopped her. "It's me," he said. "Just me." They stood in complete darkness, listening to the sounds. The rustling above grew louder, and the strange singing now seemed to be coming from the basement too. Laura realized they weren't alone. Something was here, in the dark, very close. "We need to find a way out," she whispered. "Or else." Her words were cut off by a loud thud from above. It sounded like something heavy had fallen to the floor. Then came footsteps, low, heavy, as if someone was walking through the house without trying to hide their presence. "They're here," Jake whispered. "They've found us." Laura and Jake began moving along the basement wall, trying to find an exit. Their hands slid over cold, wet stones, and sand crunched under their feet. Laura felt her heart pounding in her chest, her breath becoming shallow and rapid. She was afraid of tripping, afraid her foot would land on something soft and alive. Suddenly her hand hit something solid. It was a door. She pulled the handle, and the door creaked open. Behind it was a narrow tunnel, leading deeper into the earth. "We can't go there," Jake said. "We don't know where it leads." "We don't have a choice," Laura replied. "Or do you want to stay here with that?" They entered the tunnel. The air was even colder, and the smell of dampness and rot became unbearable. Laura walked ahead, holding onto the wall. Her fingers slid over wet stones, and water squelched under her feet. Suddenly, she heard a sound, a low, guttural murmur coming from deep within the tunnel. It resembled singing, but the melody was unnatural, as if it weren't made by human voices. "We need to go back," Jake whispered. "This is a trap." "No," Laura replied. "We have to keep going." They continued moving through the tunnel. With each step, the singing grew louder, and the air grew colder. Laura felt her legs beginning to give way, but she knew she couldn't stop. Finally, they emerged into a large cave. In the center stood an altar covered in dry leaves and bones. Laura walked closer and saw the same diary they had found in the cabin lying on the altar. She opened it and began to read. "They come every 33 years. They choose their victims and take them into the forest. No one returns. I've seen them. They look like people, but they're not. Their eyes are empty." Laura felt her heart stop. She turned around, but Jake wasn't there. "Jake," she called, but there was no answer. Instead, she heard the same strange sound from before. The singing grew louder, closer. She ran back toward the cabin, but the forest seemed alive. The trees closed in behind her, not letting her escape. When she finally reached the cabin, Jake was sitting at the table, staring into emptiness. "Jake, what happened?" she asked, but he didn't respond. His eyes were empty. Suddenly, the door burst open. On the threshold stood hooded figures. Their faces were hidden, but Laura could feel them watching her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figures moved toward her, and the last thing she saw was Jake's empty eyes staring at her without emotion. Epilogue. A few weeks later, a new couple arrived at the cabin. They found a strange board game on the table. "Oh, let's play," the girl said. Her boyfriend smiled and opened the box. The first card he drew read, "Welcome to the game."